Okay, for this first video, I just want to introduce you in a broad way to the two devices that we're going to be using most throughout this mini-series. Those devices are the Simpler device and the Drum Racks device. I think it makes sense to start with Simpler first, so we'll go there. You can find Simpler over here in the Ableton Live device chooser. You have a variety of tabs over here. You'll just want to click on this little rectangular one right here. Next, open up your Instruments folder here, and then scroll down and find the Simpler device. You just double click on it, it will create a new track with the Simpler already loaded up. I'll delete these other two tracks for now so we can just focus on the Simpler. Now broadly speaking, the Simpler is just a basic free software sampler that comes with Ableton Live. It's a great bread and butter sampling device with all of the required features to do some really great sample-based music production, but with a very simple interface. So the first thing you're going to want to do is obviously to get some audio into Simpler. And that's just a matter of finding a sound file anywhere on your computer and dragging it right into the Simpler device. I'll just come down to my sample library and drag in an audio file. You just have to drag and drop it right onto the sample window here. And then you have these two handy flags that define how much of the sample will actually play back. So if I set the flags like this and then trigger the sample, you can see that playback begins at the first flag here. I'll go ahead and turn this up just a little bit. If you want the playback position to loop between these two flags, just turn on looping. Now if you want to zoom in on what you're doing here, just come up to the sample window and your cursor will turn into a magnifying glass. Hold down your left mouse button and just drag down. That'll zoom in. Now if you want to change the point at which the sample begins to play back between these two flags, just manipulate your start point position here. You can set a loop up between the start position and the end flag just by adjusting the loop setting, and as you can see, if I set it exactly to 50%, it will go to the halfway point between the start setting and the end flag. So when you initially trigger the sound, it will play through from the start point, go all the way through to the end point, and then start looping back and forth between the loop position and the end point. Now if you add in the length knob, you can see that you can have a loop length of less than 100%. That is, the loop will not last all the way until the end flag, so if I bring it down enough, you can see So you can see that the looping features are pretty elastic within the Simpler device, and you can have a lot of fun just scanning through a waveform like that and really messing up the sound. Fade just sets up a crossfade envelope at the looping boundaries. That way if you have any clicks and pops happening at the looping boundaries, you can get rid of them fairly easily. And also the snap button will help you get rid of clicks and pops by snapping all of these settings to 0 crossings in the waveform. That is, places in the waveform where there is absolutely no sound. And of course, when you have loop settings on 0 crossings, you're very unlikely to get any clicks and pops at the loop boundaries, and everything will sound much smoother. Now you might be asking why there's a snap button and a fade button if they both have the purpose of getting rid of clicks and pops at loop boundaries. And that's a good question. The snap button is really for mono sounds like this one. As you can see, there's only one channel of information here. It's a mono sound. So if I turn on snap, Ableton Live only has to worry about finding a 0 crossing on this one channel of information. If I loaded in a stereo sound, you'd see two channels of information here. And of course, as you know, the two sides of a stereo sound can be drastically different, and thus it's far more unlikely that you're going to find a place where there's a 0 crossing on both the left and the right channels. So if we were dealing with a stereo sound rather than a mono sound here, it'd be better just to use fade, and that will actually go through and perform some operations on the loop points to smooth out any clicks and pops. Moving on to the envelope section, we have three different ones here for pitch, filter, and volume, as you can see. Volume is always activated, and you have the standard ADSR, attack, decay, sustain, release envelope. Filter and pitch have to be activated manually. As you can see, the filter one is grayed out right now, and that's because the filter down here isn't actually activated. So when I turn that on, the filter envelope then becomes activated. Also, take note that you have to assign the envelopes in varying amounts to the relative parameters that they modify. For instance, the filter envelope can be assigned right here in the envelope field here in the filter section. If I try to modify the filter settings right now, they won't have any effect because the filter envelope isn't actually applied to the filter yet. But if I apply it all the way up to 72, which is max, and set up some kind of an interesting filter frequency setting, you'll now hear the filter envelope take effect. Same thing with the pitch envelope. If I come down here and set up the envelope amount to, say, +7 semitones, and then set the pitch envelope's attack setting up a little bit, you'll hear it take effect. It starts at 0 semitones of transposition, that is the bass tuning at which I play it, moves up 7 semitones, and then comes back down to 0 semitones again, using this envelope settings. So in short, attack is a nice way to set up a fade-in for some kind of effect, whether it be volume, filter, or pitch. The attack level will eventually drop to the sustain level, whatever that may be. Right now I have it set at 0%, so sustain is basically the bass tuning for the pitch envelope here. So as the envelope moves over the attack period, it will take whatever the decay time is set at to move to the sustain period. So it moves up over 457 milliseconds to +7 semitones, and then it takes 600 milliseconds from there to come back down to a 0% change in the bass tuning. And then of course the release phase is whatever happens when I release a key, so it'll take 50 milliseconds to go back to normal once I release the key. We'll talk more in depth about envelopes later on when we're doing a little bit of drum design, but for now realize that these ADSR envelopes are a good way to fade in and out with different effects for your sound. Moving over here to the pan section, pan just moves your sound around in the stereo spectrum. You can set it to random so that every time you trigger a key, the pan setting will be a random position in the stereo spectrum. The percentage value in the random field here simply represents how much % deviation the random can go from the bass pan position. So if I have pan set to center by default, and I set this to 50%, that means that the pan can deviate 50% left or right in a random way from center position. So every time I trigger a key, the pan position will be different. I'll set that back to 0. Additionally, you can set the LFO to modulate pan. If you come down here, you have to activate the LFO first. And then if I come back up to pan and set it to some % to be modulated by the LFO, you can hear the LFO modifying the pan position. Speaking of the LFO, let's just go over that real quickly. You have a variety of different waveforms that you can use. You won't be able to see all of them because it'll be cropped off the screen right now. But you have things like sine and square and triangle waves to work with. You can set its frequency, that is how fast it's actually modulating something. So we already have it set to modulate pan. If I set the frequency higher, it'll move the pan around faster. Rate simply means that you have a choice between synchronizing the LFO's rate to the project tempo up here, or setting the LFO to its own speed setting that's unrelated to the project tempo. Right now it's set so that it's unrelated to the tempo. It's moving at its own frequency of 1.49 Hz. However, if I click on this note button right here, you can set the LFO to modulate at certain beat settings. So right now it's moving at 16th notes, third notes, 3/4 notes, whole notes, etc. Moving back over here to the filter, you have frequency and resonance settings. Frequency is of course just the frequency at which the cuts will be made. Resonance is basically a way to accentuate the area around the frequency that you've chosen over here. Resonance basically increases the volume of the frequencies around the frequency that you've chosen here. So resonance can be a great way to accentuate a specific frequency range, and we'll be using that to great effect once we start stacking sounds in the drum racks. Of course you can assign the LFO to modify the filter frequency, I'll just unassign the envelope for now and turn the LFO up a little bit. And then I'll also turn up the frequency of the LFO so you can hear it modulating the filter frequency. And of course you have a wide range of choices as to what kind of filter you're using. Again, this will be cut off because of the cropping on the videos, but you have all the basic choices: high pass, band pass, and low pass, as well as a notch filter. The other features of Simpler are far less important for our purposes right now, so we'll leave them alone for now. Let's go ahead and move on to the drum racks device. I'll come back up here to my Live Devices chooser, and I'll go ahead and drag it into the interface here and create a new track with a drum rack on it. What I love about the drum rack interface upon first viewing is that it looks like a software version of an MPC. You have your 16 pads here, and of course you can assign any kind of sound to these pads. Unlike an MPC or an MV8000, however, you can drag not only sounds onto these pads, but also devices themselves. So for instance, pad C2 up here, that is the pad that's triggered by the note C2, could just as easily be triggering a synthesizer as a sampler. And of course you can drag effects devices and all kinds of other insane stuff onto these pads and create a really nice little performance unit here. If you click on these buttons over here to the left, you'll open up more of Drum Rack's features. The top button opens up the macro knob view. These 8 knobs can be assigned to any of the parameters and any of the devices that are contained within the Drum Rack's interface. Not only that, each knob can be assigned to more than one thing, and in varying amounts. So you could have, for instance, one macro knob turning down your filter frequency while simultaneously increasing the decay time on a reverb. This is a very powerful feature because it essentially allows you to group related parameters together in your different devices and create various sound design possibilities as well as live performance possibilities. If you click on the second button right here, you open up the chain view. Each pad is represented by a chain over here. Of course, there are no chains yet because there are no devices on the pads. If I come back over here and just drag my Simpler device, hover over the track until it shows up, and then release the Simpler right over pad C2, it will automatically create a chain right here. And of course you can see the name change on the pad as well. If you double click on the chain, it will bring up the device or devices that actually represent what the chain is doing. As you can see, we're back to the Simpler that we created before. Now the nice thing is that one chain can be triggering multiple sounds at the same time. And we'll take advantage of that feature when I show you how to stack up different sounds in the drum rack later. Moving down here, we have the all-important I/O button, and that gives you more options over here in the chain view. Receive and play are pretty self-explanatory. What this says right now is that when this chain receives the note C2, it will play the note C3. So it's kind of a MIDI note filter for you if you like. Choke groups are incredibly important, especially when you're talking about sample-based music production, because they allow you to take one sound and cut it off with another sound. That way you don't have multiple sounds overlapping one another and creating a muddy mix. Later on, when we actually slice up a breakbeat loop that we get from a record, we'll have each of the slices laid out on the pads, similar to what you would do on an MPC. Now, if you're interested in sample-based music production, you probably already know that sometimes you like to trigger the pads in ways that would overlap the audio with one another, but you don't want that to happen all the time. So let me show you how that works. I'll go ahead and make a copy of this pad and create a new chain. On the Mac, that's Option. On the PC, that's Alt. You just hold that button down, left-click down, and drag it over, and you've created a copy. As you can see, a new chain was created over here. Let me just create a slight difference between the two sounds so we can hear which chain is being triggered at what time. I'll take our second chain here and just transpose it up, say 3 semitones. Also, I'm just going to unassign the LFO on both devices to the filter frequency, just so that the example is a little more clear. And also I'll bring up the filter frequency on each device. Now a nice little shortcut here, if you want to copy one of these device parameters to every other device that's inside of a drum rack pad, you just right click on it and go to Copy Value to Siblings. And that just automatically copied this filter frequency value up to the other chain. Next I'll set a long release time on both simplers. I'll right click again and go to copy value to siblings. Let me just turn that down a bit. Now as you can hear, both of these chains are overlapping one another when I trigger them. Sometimes that's good, but sometimes it isn't. The best way to fix that problem is just to set both of these chains to the same choke group. So I'm setting them both to choke group 1. Now when I trigger them, one will cut off the sound of the other. Again, that technique is going to become extremely important when you're chopping up a breakbeat and trying to rearrange the pieces into your own composition. The last thing I want to show you about the drum racks here is the sends and returns view. If you turn on S and R, you'll get a sends and returns view over here. From here you can actually drag audio effects into the drum rack itself and then send the chains to the effects just like you would up here in the main live interface with the sends and returns. So if I go ahead and open up my audio effects folder, and let's use the usual example of a reverb, I'll just drag that in and now I have a reverb send set up. I'll just double click on it and set the dry wet, and also set the decay time up quite a bit here so we can hear an obvious difference. Now I can set one of these chains to be wet with the reverb and the other one dry with no reverb. So that's a nice way to keep all of the effects that your drum rack relies on inside of the drum rack itself without having to rely on the main live interface up here. The reason that's attractive is that you can send a chopped up breakbeat that's all changed up and sent to various effects and everything with macro knobs, the whole deal. And it's all in one handy drum rack unit, and you don't even have to worry about dealing with the main live view up here if you just want to mess around with your chopped breaks. So that's it for a basic introduction to the two main devices that we're going to use. In the next video, we're going to take a look at how to actually get audio into Ableton Live.